That should be a step in the right direction.
True, but also if you don't have the talent at all, and the one guy who has talent is an aloof player, as it is in Laramie Tunsil, then, I mean, crap. What's the biggest lesson the Texans can take away from last night's massacre of Kansas City?
Fix your offensive line. Number one, because it was the problem all year. We all knew it, and it exposed the Texans all season. But last night we saw, like, if you can't protect your quarterback, they got no shot. It doesn't matter if you have C.J. Stroud, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts. Like, if your quarterback's not protected, if your quarterback doesn't have time back there, then, like, you've got no shot to win a game when it matters most. If a team can get after you without sending a single blitzer in the entire game, then you can't win football games. So you got to fix your offensive line.
Well, I don't see how you do that in one off season.
Well, I don't know that either.
When the Chiefs lost to the Bucks in the Super Bowl, they got very aggressive in addressing their offensive line the offseason right afterwards. And I remember there were a lot of teams across the NFL that were trying to do the same thing. I was up in Seattle at the time, and I remember Russell Wilson somehow made that Super Bowl loss for Patrick Mahomes all about him, saying, like, yeah, that's how I felt when I was out there, losing in the second round of the playoffs again. He was running for his life behind an offensive line that didn't work. But I don't know that you can fix all of that. So I really think the biggest lesson is you need to have the best possible pass rush. And I think when you take a look at what the Texans have, they're definitely off to a great start, having Will Anderson, having Danielle Hunter. You take a look at the defensive tackles, and I felt like they got a lot out of that group considering they didn't put that much capital into it. A lot of guys that they brought in during the offseason, and Danico Autry, but I would say that generally across the league weren't in high demand. Can you make that better than it already is? Because if you don't, your linebackers, who are not that good in coverage, are going to get exposed. And it's hard to find linebackers like a Zach Bond for Philadelphia, who was essentially on the scrap heap this offseason. You don't know where you're going to find a guy like that. So what you can do is try your absolute best to find a guy like that. But more importantly, I think you want to continue to add to your pass rush so that you can win a game where you're just sending a couple of guys and you know that they're going to wreak havoc.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the easiest thing that they can replicate from last night's game is that. I think the one that it's because you could have taken him in theory. The Will Anderson was the right pick still. I think because of all the chaos that was going on around Jalen Carter at the time. But that, to me, seems like the one area where I feel like the Texans' defensive line can improve the most is on the interior. Like on the edge, they're great. Hunter, Anderson, any guys I feel like they were rolling out there were really good this year. But I feel like you can upgrade from Foley Fatukasi. Like, he was good for you this year, but I think you can still upgrade that position. You could upgrade from Mark Edwards. So if you're going to replicate one of those things, that's where it starts, because that's part of the reason why also I feel like the Eagles' corners were so good this year. Like, yes, they're good. They're good players, and so are the Texans' corners. But when you're constantly getting that much pressure on people, it makes it so much easier for the other team. And that's the one where, like, it wouldn't – I think some people might be upset with it, Paul, but like if they draft a defensive tackle with the 25th pick, if it's the best player on the board, like, it's not the worst decision ever. There are other needs to fix, but part of, like, it could make a lot of sense just to go, like, really all in with, like, one group of players.
Go best player available. You haven't had the best luck in the drafts of late when it comes to offensive linemen. You just haven't. I mean, Titus Howard, back of the first-round pick. Xavier Suafilo, first pick of the second round. Is Drew Scruggs that good? Kenyon Green, that's a top 10 pick. You've had lots of guys come in and out, and it hasn't worked out so well. So, yeah, I'm with you in that you can't be married to drafting a specific position with that 25th selection.
Yeah, you just have to do what's best for the team. If you really need to draft a specific guy, like, in the draft, then you have to move up and go get him. You can't just be like, well, we have to get a guard, because I think we see teams make. I think usually that's where they make their worst mistakes in the draft is when whether it's quarterback. I think a lot of times, like, quarterback is obviously where it gets amplified, where it's like, well, we need a quarterback, so we're just going to take one. Like, if Titans take Cam Ward this year, well, they're just taking one to take one. But if you take the best player, whether it's a position that you have strength at or weakness at, it's usually what's best for your roster. And that's what the Eagles have done. The Eagles drafted a defensive lineman in the first round for like 3 straight years. They went Nolan Smith. They had Jalen Carter. They had another one. I think it was before that. They constantly just kept doing it. And this year, they doubled down in the second round and in the first round with cornerbacks. They drafted Quinion Mitchell in the first, and then they drafted Cooper DeJean in the second because they were the best players on the board, and they were a position of need also.
It was a position of need, right? Their defense last year was awful, and Vic Fangio deserves a lot of credit. But bringing in 2 corners in the draft, that fixed that position. But that's also a position for the Texans that, sure, you can address it if you want, but I really think the secondary is pretty good going into next year. You have to figure out what you're doing with Derek Stingley and his contract. But Kamari Lassiter had a hell of a year for a second-round pick being your starting corner from the get-go. Kalen Bullock, I think there's a lot of upside there. Secondary, I think, is good. Trenches can always be better, and you should always be adding as much talent as you possibly can to your offensive line and your defensive line. You can't stop. Like, it is one there. That's why Philadelphia won more than anything. It's just their offensive line has depth. One of their guys got injured. They put in somebody else. Didn't miss a beat. Maybe it was a little difficult for them to run the football. And then on the defensive line, too, it's not just one guy for Philadelphia, but it was that 4, the guys who they were rotating in and out, consistently generating pressure, whether it's Brandon Graham, who's been in the league for a while, or Jalen Carter, who's only in his second year.
I mean, even look at their offensive line, like what they did this offseason. Like, they brought in a huge bust in Mekhi Becton. He was a massive bust for the New York Jets at tackle. They bring him in. They transition him to guard. They coach him well. And he's an impact player for them on a Super Bowl team. Like, you can find guys. You can fix your offensive line. You can find, like you mentioned, Zach Bond, like the scrap heap. I mean, now Howie Roseman's the best GM in the NFL. It's hard to even argue at this point. Like, with what they do in the draft and free agency, winning Super Bowls with 2 different coaches, 2 different quarterbacks, like going there with, nearly going there with Carson Wentz at one point. Like, they've crushed their evaluation of everything. Even just drafting Jalen Hurts in the second round, when you had Carson Wentz, who just paid, has worked out so well for them. But, like, you also have to be, you got to coach these guys well. Because you could find a Mekhi Becton and make him serviceable at guard for you.
Coaching is big. You got to have better offensive line coaching this season. A lot of pressure on Cole Popovich. Same thing with your offensive coordinator. A lot of pressure on Nick Caley. I do think it's going to be very hard for them to fix this offensive line in one offseason. I just given the way that they operate. Are you going to spend big in free agency? It's going to be difficult for you to do that without restructuring a bunch of contracts, without taking some folks out back and old yellering their ass, right? So that's something that I think is going to be a multi-year process. If they can fix it in one offseason, then that might be the best job Nick Caserio's done to this point, which is crazy because he's done a lot of things pretty well.
Yeah, I think fix is nearly impossible, but improve greatly is on the table. Between coaching, development, bringing people in, like, you can improve the offensive line to where at least, like, C.J. Stroud's not getting slaughtered every game.
Yeah, get it improve to average.
Yes.
Improve to, oh my God, our quarterback's going to get murdered.
I think we got to see them get to below average before we can ask for them to get to average.
I would like to blow past below average.
Yeah.
Just like
skip that.
I would too.
Make the 3 moves that get you to average, and then make the 2 moves that get you over the top.
Because even if that's just leaving Titus at left guard going into the season, if he's still on the roster, and leaving Blake Fisher at right tackle, like, in theory, if they develop well and they coach well, that should be a step in the right direction.
True, but also if you don't have the talent at all, and the one guy who has talent is an aloof player, as it is in Laramie Tunsil, then, I mean, crap.
You're right.
And that's one thing about the Eagles, too, is where if you look through their, like, draft history, like, they're just, every single draft, they're leaving with an offensive lineman.
And they're finding guys, whether it's Jason Kelsey, who doesn't play for them anymore, of course, at the end of the draft, or it's, a guy who's playing rugby in effing Australia who just happened to be 6'8" and Jordan Mailata. I mean, that's...
Yeah.
They have gone through unconventional means, and I don't think the Texans have done that yet. So I would say, yeah, offensive line, it is probably priority number 1. Defensive line, priority number 2. The trenches win you Super Bowls.